Today on Ancient DOS Games, we have a bit of an unusual one, known as Afterlife. Now, normally when you think about old city building games, your mind's instantly going to track back to SimCity and SimCity 2000. But Maxis wasn't the only company trying to do these kinds of simulations. Well, heck, SimCity 2000's aesthetics themselves were actually borrowed from a similar Japanese game series known as A-Train. But here instead, we have an example of a city management sim from LucasArts, and their take is that instead of trying to simulate an earthly city, you've been given the role of a new demiurge responsible for creating and managing successful planes of both heaven and hell. Now, at first glance, this game is going to look extremely creative. There's some fitting music on hand, the graphics are extremely well done on an individual level, though things can sometimes feel cluttered, as is pretty common with city simulation games, and there is a ton of personality in the form of a pair of assistants who can give you advice on how to proceed, and lore surrounding every single structure that you can place or which can pop up in your zones. Heck, some of these structures even have unique pre-rendered images to go along with them for your viewing pleasure. However, as far as the gameplay is concerned, there is a key flaw with this game, something which completely derails it from having the same sort of feel that the SimCity games have, and I'm not going to spoil it because I want to see if anyone else watching can guess what it is before we get to the end of the video, because it's a fundamental problem which just completely tanks this game's replayability. Afterlife was primarily spearheaded by Michael Stemmle over at LucasArts, was published in 1996, and is a one-player simulation game. It only supports SVGA 256 color graphics running as low as 640 by 480 resolution, or as high as 1152 by 864, though typically when running this in DOSBox, the highest you'll be able to set is 1024 by 768. In terms of audio, it supports a small array of popular audio devices for the time. As for its current release date, it's still commercial and not all that difficult to obtain, with a couple really important things to keep in mind if you go searching out a physical copy. Now, if all you want to do is play the game, then the simplest approach is to grab it from GOG or Steam, as it's available as a digital download from either for $6. However, if you prefer a physical copy, it's actually fairly cheap to find, with loose copies typically going for only $4 to $5, or between $10 and $20 if it comes with all the stuff that was inside the original box. However, one extremely important thing to keep in mind is that it's very easy to get the DOS and Macintosh releases confused with each other. In fact, during my searches, I found listings for loose copies where it would have the Macintosh jewel case, but the DOS CD-ROM inside of it. So you need to be extra diligent about getting this game for the platform that you actually want it for. And as for fully boxed copies, that might be quite a bit trickier. Afterlife had a very unusual box which is designed to open from the middle as opposed to any of its sides. Thus, it's very hard to find fully boxed copies, and I wasn't able to gauge what the prices should be like when you do, as all I found was a listing for a sealed copy at around $200, but sealed and fully boxed are two very different beasts, and not really a good indicator of what that box is really worth, especially when the contents never go for more than $20.
Damn. Hand me those electrocardial stimulators, nurse.
Okay, so when you first boot Afterlife, you're treated to a cutscene that seems like it would be more in place for an alien medical sim than a city simulator. But immediately following, we get our title screen and the ability to start a new game, load a saved game, or load a scenario, of which the base game comes with only 4, which should already be a warning sign as to what's in store for us, but let's keep going. You're also able to select your difficulty level when starting a new game, though as far as I can tell, all this affects is how much money you start with and how often disasters can occur. Now, you're then given a randomly generated map for both planes of existence and set to task to build your realm as you see fit. Though if you prefer, you can also run one of the game's built-in tutorials, which demonstrates the basic functionality of how the game is played. Though I mean to a very basic level, though at least the voice acting is fun.
Think about all those poor wandering spirits without an eternal home.
Actually, I was thinking more about the impact on the eternal budget. My dear Miss Goodhalo, helpful is my middle name.
I thought it was Herbert.
Also, here's something I initially found mystifying when watching the tutorials.
See this button here, boss? That's the one that brings up the ad infinitum siphons. It also brings up banks, but we'll talk about those later.
Yeah, they never talk about those later. In fact, doing some research, I discovered that the final release of the game is actually missing one of its planned tutorials, which covered basic economics. And I know why too, but again, we'll get into that. In any case, here's the basic gist of it. In the background of the simulation you see here, there's a planet your souls are coming from. Now this planet has various populations on it with varying levels of technology and various systems of belief, but every person on the planet eligible to enter the afterlife is referred to as an ethically mature biological organism, or EMBO for short. When an EMBO dies, their soul will be sent to an appropriate gate in your heaven or hell, and then will move into a structure in one of the 7 zones that you've laid out, with the 7 zones in heaven being references to the rewards of contentment, charity, temperance, diligence, chastity, peacefulness, and humility, while the 7 zones in hell are references to the deadly sins of envy, avarice, gluttony, sloth, lust, wrath, and pride. Now, depending on beliefs, each soul who arrives will either be a permanent or temporary resident, with temporary residents eventually taking soul trains to be reincarnated. So, essentially, at the most basic level of the simulation, in both heaven and hell, you need to set up a gate, some roads connected to the gate, some zones which extend no more than 3 tiles away from a road, a karma station, and finally, karma tracks so that trains can take people from the karma stations to the karma portals already placed on the map, which will reincarnate them. Though because the tracks run between heaven and hell, they only have to be anchored on one plane or the other, not both. Now, this will get you going, but you're going to rapidly discover that you're spending a ton of money per in-game year paying for angels and demons to man all of your structures, mostly the ones built up automatically in the zones you laid out. Now, the main tactic for mitigating this is to train your own demons and angels out of the permanent populations and give them utopias and dystopias to reside in. The training centers need to be attached to the main roads, but since angels and demons can fly, their residences can be placed anywhere. The idea is that by training homegrown angels and demons and giving them a place to live, they don't have to commute from the other realms and it'll be much cheaper. Though if you don't mitigate the admission rates to your training centers, the overall quality of your angels and demons will drop over time, which in turn affects the efficiency of your structures and thus how much money is made from them per inhabitant. That said, you're going to spend the entire game balancing your admission rates appropriately, because if your local population of angels and demons ever gets too close to the actual amount you need, some of them won't be able to find work and will subsequently riot. The game itself will warn you when you hit the 10% mark in terms of angels or demons being imported, so that you know to intervene before things get out of hand. There's a few other mechanics too which you have at your disposal, including ports for ferrying souls across rivers, limbo bars to give lost souls a temporary place to get drunk while waiting for appropriate accommodations to open up, which can be surprisingly important given that the cost to house a soul goes up by a factor of 10 if they're lost and have nowhere to stay, banks for loaning you cash, and siphons for collecting a special kind of energy from the rocks known as ad infinitum, which allows your zone structures to upgrade into bigger and better structures automatically. Actually, I kind of have a pet peeve with that particular term, ad infinitum, because I've always pronounced it ad infinitum. Because not only is that how it's spelled, but also because it's based on the word infinity, which has 3 short I's, not 2 short I's and a long one. I mean, come on, you don't say infinity, do you? I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I hate English. Anyway, so we've now got all the basics figured out. We know what the job of a demiurge is, what you have to do to succeed, and so it's just a matter of doing what you're supposed to and raking in the cash, right? Well, no, because my first 2 attempts to actually get anywhere in this game failed miserably. I was consistently stuck making way less money than I was spending trying to keep the realms in working order, and for a while I was convinced it was impossible to actually succeed in this game. However, I got my next clue that something was up with this game's simulation model when I started looking through the scenarios, because each of them had to be grown up from nothing to reach the point where they could now become scenario-like material. And by looking at their graphs, I noticed a very simple truth to this game that pretty much dictates exactly how every session is going to go. Bigger is better. And not only that, bigger is necessary. Thinking back to games like SimCity and SimCity 2000, you can make small cities in those games with only a few thousand inhabitants and still earn cash. Now, obviously, bigger makes more cash, but the point is, the simulation model is accounting for these sorts of variables appropriately, and because of that, those city builders give you a lot more freedom to make your city however you want. Maxis even went out of its way to refer to the SimCity series as quote-unquote software toys as opposed to games, the idea being that you just play around with it however you want, without there being an overarching goal that you have to hit. So I tried one more time to put together a functional heaven and hell, and basically all I did was spend like crazy to make the place as big as possible, as fast as possible, and that did the trick. Now, mind you, what I had created wasn't well proofed against disasters or other negative effects, but the point is, going bigger solved the problem of not being able to earn enough money to keep the place working properly. Also, the game's doing a lot of extra things in the background, such as tracking vibes, which also affects the efficiency of structures, with good vibes enhancing efficiency in heaven and bad vibes enhancing efficiency in hell. But there's not really much consistency in how this plays out. I mean, consider in a game such as SimCity where you have 3 zone types: residential, commercial, and industrial. Residential is where people live, commercial is where they shop and hang out, and industrial is where they work. Now, these zones each impact each other in various predictable ways, but here in Afterlife, all 7 zones are essentially just living structures which permanent residents generally never leave, so there's not really a predictable or meaningful way that these all cross-interact with each other. Those interactions are indeed there, but they're not important enough to deal with when simply going big wins every time. The funny thing, though, is that LucasArts definitely figured out at some point in development that this was the crux of the game, and there's a couple ways I can prove this. The first has to do with the way disasters are disabled. Now, just like with SimCity, you can turn off the disasters in this game, but as soon as you attempt to do it, you're told that doing so cuts your soul rate in half. Unless you've already suffered tons of disasters trying to make a huge plane of existence, you're not going to have enough of an income to sustain only receiving half of it from your souls. So the game's already roping you down a path of being forced to learn its intricacies. But more pertinently, the manual doesn't really do a good job of explaining the game's intricacies either. It goes over what they are, just not how it all interacts. In fact, the manual isn't even included in the GOG release, but I still managed to find a copy and read through it, and can confirm there's little useful information in there with regards to how to actually succeed at this game. You see, everything comes down to that soul rate you see in the bottom corner of your controls window, and every facet of this game is notably ambiguous about how you get this to go up, because there's an official strategy guide. Yeah, nuts to SimCity and SimCity 2000 for including extra thick manuals which properly detailed how to make a functioning city with a net positive income. Here comes Afterlife, which wants to suck even more cash out of you just to learn how to manipulate this one number which ultimately determines if you succeed or fail. Overall, Afterlife is definitely an interesting concept for a game, and aesthetically, it does the job. A lot of imagination and effort was clearly put into this game in a lot of ways. But that's kind of the problem, is that this isn't a software toy. This is a game. When you realize the entire premise of everything going on in terms of gameplay revolves around raising just a single number through methods which aren't even explained to the player without buying an extra strategy guide on top of getting the game itself, goes to show how weak the underlying simulation actually is, despite its intricacies, especially given that the only way to reliably succeed is to go big or go home. That's not the mark of a city simulation, and as a city simulation, this game fails to achieve that feeling. But at least it fails with wit and charm every step of the way. Funnily enough, even though mid-90s games tend to be tricky to get working right in DOSBox, all you have to do for this one is leave cycle set to auto and it should run perfectly fine. Let's save for some occasional sound skipping when your advisors are speaking. Though again, I couldn't get the 1152x864 graphics mode working, and I'm not exactly sure why. Clearly 1152x864 had to exist for this game's installation utility to even suggest it, but when running the game in DOSBox, that mode isn't even made available. It could be a Windows-only thing, it could be a Mac-only thing, or it could be that DOSBox itself isn't exposing that video mode in the emulation for whatever reason. If anyone has any ideas on that, let me know and I can add the info into the additional information section in the video description. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on October 23rd, is going to be an ADG Pro video. Yeah, I haven't actually had one of those since May, and it's not for a lack of ideas, just a lack of desire to want to go back and play more of the games that those ideas are for. But I finally came up with one that I wanted to give a shot, so we're going to go back to an old top-down shooter with borrowed sound effects to see which of its weapons are the best bang for the buck, so be sure to stay tuned to see how it goes. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.